Without objection.
Mr. President, it is difficult to believe that it's happening, but I've seen it. It was about 3 weeks ago. I was in El Paso, Texas, and I went down to see what was happening at our border. You can't escape all the stories that have been written about the number of people who are coming to our border and what's happening to them. And I wanted to see it for myself. And I saw what was a detention facility for people who had been stopped at the border. It was a cell with a plate glass window so that you could see everything inside. Above the door of the cell, it said capacity 35. And I looked inside and counted, took the time to slowly count. And I counted 150 men in that cell, standing shoulder to shoulder. A few of them could sit on the benches on the side of the walls. 150. There was one toilet in that cell. They were fed their meals to eat standing up. They slept taking turns lying down on the floor. Some of them would be there for 3 days, some as long as 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Next to that cell was another one with a plate glass window you could see inside. And above the door it read capacity 16. This was a cell for women. I counted 75 women in that cell, capacity 16. There were 4 or 5 of them with nursing babies. I've since learned that in the few weeks since I saw this and witnessed it firsthand, things have gotten dramatically worse. The cell with 150 now has almost 200 men jammed into it. The cell with the women, even worse than what I saw when I visited. If I described these conditions in a prison in some foreign country, you would say, for goodness sakes, the United States of America should speak up for human rights. We cannot allow human beings to be treated that way. This detention facility for these immigrants is in the United States of America. It has to come to an end. And it has to start with a commitment by the people of this country through their elected representatives in Congress and this president to stop this inhumane treatment of these individuals. Today I'm sending a letter that I never thought I would send, joining other senators in a letter to the International Red Cross. You see, we call on the International Red Cross to go to developing countries and look at their prison situations and decide whether they are humane. I cannot believe that I'm asking them to do this in the United States of America, but because I have seen it with my own eyes and I've been told that it's getting worse, I feel I have no choice. I'm also asking for the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security to immediately, on an emergency basis, review the detention facilities for adults and children. Why do I raise that point? Because we know what this administration did last year in a project called Zero Tolerance. Zero Tolerance, announced by the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, said we'll treat everyone who comes to our border as a criminal. Understand that people can come to our border and present themselves, as many of these people do, and ask for asylum. They have not violated any law of the United States at that point. They've turned themselves in. They're not sneaking in. They've turned themselves in for an adjudication as to whether they're eligible to be in this country. But Attorney General Sessions said last year, we will treat them as criminals, and therefore, because they are suspected criminals, we will remove their children from them. How many kids under zero tolerance were taken by the Trump administration away from their parents? 2,880. I know that number because a federal judge in Southern California took this administration to court and said, I want an accounting for every one of those children. I saw those children, at least some of them, in Chicago. They go through a bureaucratic process and end up at agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, this Health and Human Services, as a matter of fact, agencies, to try to place them in foster care or connect them up with a member of their family. I remember in a room they brought in some of the children who'd been taken away from their parents. There were two little 4-year-old girls who I thought were sisters, and then as I looked more closely, I realized they weren't. They just seemed like sisters, and they had become friends at that facility. 4 years old, holding hands. We gave them crayons and coloring books, which you'd give to little kids. Then I went to an immigration court proceeding in downtown Chicago, in an office building. You'd never know it from the street. But on the 4th floor of this high-rise, we have a U.S. immigration court. And a very caring judge was there, and she was trying to get through a docket that was very heavy. And she invited me to stay for the first case of the day. It involved 2 clients. It was tough to get this proceeding underway because zero tolerance had resulted in more children coming into these immigration courts. And the difficulty in getting this hearing underway was that she said, before we start, I want everyone to take their seats. It was hard to get Marta to take her seat. Marta was 2 years old. She had to be lifted into the chair and handed a stuffed animal for her hearing. Lucky for the other client, Hamilton spotted one of those Matchbox cars on top of the table, and 4-year-old Hamilton scrambled up into the chair. In the United States of America, an immigration hearing, and the clients were 2 years old and 4 years old because of the conscious policy of this administration to separate children from their parents. So we have this setting with detention cells jammed with people in inhumane circumstances and the separation of children from their parents. I sent a letter to the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security asking about these children who've been separated. He came back to me a few months ago and said, we've discovered there were more. Before they announced it, this administration had been separating infants, toddlers, and children from their parents as they presented themselves at the border. The judge who was involved in the case in Southern California stepped in and asked, well, how many? Today it's reported at least 1,712 more kids may have been separated. That means we're over 4,500 babies, toddlers, infants, and children separated from their parents by this administration. Sadly, some of these children will not be reunited. Their parents were sent back, usually to Central American countries that they came from. And now the kids are in the system and way too young to even remember who mom was, who dad was. This circumstance has reached the point of a humanitarian crisis on our border. How can this president, who was elected promising that he would do something about immigration, have brought us to this terrible moment where we have more people presenting themselves at the border than we've had in history, certainly those with children. We've never had people in these numbers showing up. And the tougher this president's rhetoric is, the meaner his tweets are, the more people come to our borders. It's exactly the opposite of what he promised us. This circumstance here is absolutely intolerable, unacceptable, and embarrassing to our country. That we would have to call on an international organization to look at the way that we are treating people in the United States. I'm sorry that it's come to this, but in good conscience, I can't ignore it. The most recent news report says another child died at the border. I think that brings the total to 4 in the last few weeks. Is that what America's come to? We need to have an immigration policy that makes sense. Absolutely, we must have border security. In an age of terrorism and an age of drug epidemics, I want to know who's coming into this country, and I want to know what they're bringing with them. Secondly, the United States certainly cannot accept everyone in the world who wants to come here. It's understandable they want to live in this great country. That's what brought my grandmother and mother to these shores, as immigrants to this country. But we cannot accept everyone in the world. And third, we don't want anyone dangerous coming into this country, period. No exceptions. And if you're dangerous and not legal in this country, you should be gone. But having said that, now it's our burden to come up with a comprehensive immigration bill that makes sense for this nation of immigrants in the 21st century. Unfortunately, the United States Senate in this empty chamber tells you how much work we do on legislation. We give speeches. We ran for the Senate to give speeches. And occasionally, we vote on another nominee every few hours. That's it. You won't see a comprehensive immigration bill come to the floor of the Senate. It hasn't. Not this year and not for the previous 6 years. But the last time it did, I was part of a bipartisan effort that wrote one that passed the Senate with, I believe, 67 votes. An overwhelming roll call, bipartisan, in favor of immigration reform that died in the Republican-controlled House, and there's never been another try since. Why were we elected to come here if we can't face this problem squarely, dealing with what's going on our border and making sense out of our immigration system? This is a humanitarian nightmare on our border. But I'll tell you another one. This president decided to end the DACA program. I know a little bit about that, maybe more than some of my colleagues, because it was 19 years ago that I introduced a bill. We do a lot of that. But this bill was called the DREAM Act, 19 years ago. It said if you were brought to this country as a child, you lived here and went to school and didn't get in trouble with the law, you ought to have a chance to become legal in America. That was it. And for 19 years, we've been trying to make it the law of the land. Unable to get 60 votes in the Senate, we always got a majority, but never the 60 votes that we needed. And I appealed to my former Senate colleague and friend, President Obama, and said, can you do something to help these young people who have never known another country and want to be part of the United States in its future? Many of the school children who visit us here get up in their classrooms every day, and I'm proud to say they put their hands over their hearts and pledge allegiance to that flag. These kids do exactly the same thing. It's the only flag in the only country they've ever known. And so President Obama created what was called DACA. And 790,000 of these young people stepped up, paid a filing fee of over $500, went through a criminal background check, and they were given a chance to stay legally in the United States for 2 years at a time, not to be deported, and be able to work, be able to go to school. 790,000 of them. You know, I really believe in them. And you know human nature. Out of 790,000, there's got to be some of them in there that are going to disappoint you. But I stand here today in the Senate and tell you that in all these years since President Obama has done that, I've never heard any of those stories. These are extraordinary young men and women. I've told their stories on the floor of the Senate, over 120 of them, how these DACA-protected young people want to become part of America's future. Let me tell you about a group of them in Chicago. Loyola University in Chicago is a great school, and they have a great school of medicine. And when they heard about the DACA program, they said, we're going to open up competition to these DACA-protected young people to compete to go to medical school. And the word flashed across the country because many of these young people who dreamed of being doctors had no chance because they were undocumented. Because of DACA, they were given this temporary legal status, and because of Loyola University, they were able to apply. Over 30 of them were accepted to the medical school. Some of the brightest kids living in our country who wanted to become doctors. And there was a catch. If you went to Loyola and you needed to borrow money, and most of them did, you had to promise to give a year of service back to the state of Illinois that loaned you the money to go to school. For each year, we loaned the money. They signed up for it. They're ready to go to neighborhoods where we need doctors, and small towns, rural America, where we desperately need doctors. Well, these young people are some of the best and brightest I've ever met. Every one of them an inspiration. So when President Trump eliminated the DACA program, He eliminated their opportunity to continue their medical education. You see, after 4 years in medical school, you go into a residency, and a residency is a job, employment. And it's a lot more than 40 hours a week, I might add. But since President Trump eliminated DACA, they cannot legally take a job. This case is going through the courts now as to whether the president had the right to eliminate DACA. He did it. The second court last Friday said he was wrong. He had no reason, no basis to eliminate this program. When you hear these stories about what's happening at the border in these detention cells, when you hear about the conscious decision of this administration to separate infants and toddlers from their parents, 4,500 of them being separated, when you hear about this administration coming forward to eliminate the DACA program and to stop these medical students from becoming doctors and serving in my state where they're desperately needed, you have to ask yourself, Mr. President, what is your immigration policy? Why have you made such a mess of this situation that wasn't very good to start with? And what are we going to do about it? Anything? Not in this empty chamber. Not today. We're just going to pick up the papers every morning and say, isn't it a shame? Well, it's more than a shame. It's an embarrassment to this country that this nation of immigrants has reached this moment. Mr. President, I continue to appeal to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Please come forward and let's solve these problems together. I've been part of bipartisan groups that have come up with comprehensive bills and all sorts of legislative responses. My door is always open to anyone who wants to sit down. In the meantime, bring humanity to our border. Let us not do things with these people presenting themselves that don't speak well of our values and our reputation around the world. We can do better. We can provide humane treatment, even as Congress fails to do its job. Those people at the border deserve to be treated like human beings as we work through our legal issues and our political issues. No more separation of children from their parents. How devastating that it must be for that child. You know, when some of these parents were reunited with the children, these little babies and infants, young kids, wouldn't talk to their mothers, turned away from them. With their body language, they said what we knew was going through their mind. You abandoned me. You left me. I don't know who you are anymore. Over time, maybe they can reestablish that relationship. Child psychologists tell us there could be some damage that needs to be repaired there. And isn't that a shame that an innocent child would go through that experience? Now that we know that there were 1,712 more of these children, we need to do everything with this federal judge who had the courage to step up to reunite them as quickly as possible with their parents. In the meantime, I want to call on this administration, the Acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan, go down to the border, take a look at the detention facilities, do everything possible to make certain that there is humane treatment there. These are desperate people, risking their lives to come to this United States of America. We owe them at least humane treatment while they're here as our political and legal system works its way.